director of the Multitude Art Prize and artistic director of the Wuhan Art Terminus. We're about to start the second session of the Multitude Art Prize Discourse series. Once again, I'd like to welcome those of you who weren't with us in the morning session. And again, welcome back the speakers who have really engaged our thoughts and imaginations in the two panels this morning. Our next panel will be on the topic of the European museum network called Lancia Națională. The moderator is Zdenka Badovinac, who is director of the Moderna Galleria in Ljubljana, and she is also founder of this museum network. It's very interesting that the founder of this museum network comes from Eastern European situation, which is slightly removed from the Western European situation, but maybe that's one of the things that we're going to be discussing. On the panel are other member curators or directors of institutions, curators of institutions who are museums in the museum network Lancia Națională. Bart de Beer is director of MUCA, which is the Museum of Modern Art in Antwerp, in Belgium. November Painter is associate director of exhibitions and programs at SALT in Istanbul. And Bartomeu Mari is the director of MACBA in Barcelona. MACBA is a museum of modern contemporary art in Barcelona in Spain. I have to say that, mention that it was the conversation with Bart de Beer at MUCA that started the whole process of the relationship between the Multitude Art Prize and Lancia Națională. It was Bart's feedback on the ideas that I presented to him about the conversations that we want to develop between different regions of Asia that reminded him of the conversations that Lancia Națională have between different countries in Europe. So, without further ado, I would like to welcome the next panel. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Colin. So we are starting to present our network. Actually, we call it now Confederation International. You saw in the morning the logo of our confederation, and the logo is consisted of the name international in different languages. So as you can see, the Internationala, as we call it in Slovene. So we decided to use our own local languages. So it's kind of a multitude approach to the universal idea of that is proclaimed by the song L'International, which you all know, and you, especially here, you know the context very well. But this universal idea, we were so much talking about the multitude, but I think it's also very, very important to keep this idea of universality, how it can be explained in relation to the multitude. Also, probably the concept of the multitude itself can be understood in a kind of universal way if we try. So we started, I think it was in 2010, with this initiative in Ljubljana. Immediately, different European institutions joined the proposal. So the first founding members, besides Moderna Galleria, MACBA from Barcelona, MUCA from Antwerp, Van Abbe Museum from Eindhoven and Julius Scholar Society from Bratislava were. So last year, 2 new members joined the Confederation, Reina Sofia from Madrid and Salt from Istanbul. So the first stage of the project we finished last year, and it was defined under the title From Decline of Modernism to the Rise of Globalisation from 1957 to 1986. And this year we were so happy when we learned we got also the European grant now for 5 years, before only for 2 years, for a new umbrella project which is called the Uses of Art, the Legacy of 1848 and 1989. So of course already the name of our confederation is very telling. It is about the collaboration, but on vertical and horizontal levels, I would say. So I would like, before inviting my colleagues to talk about their own experiences, I would like to mention a few very important points that define the way, the new model, I would say, of our collaboration. So I will be using Slovene version of the song, the name Internationala. So Internationala is a network of museums in which collections, artistic research, technology and public access can be shared across member institutions. It intends to challenge traditional notions of heritage as defined in terms of exclusiveness, closure and property. So these are probably also 2 very important terms, inclusiveness and exclusiveness, which I think we didn't mention this morning. So this shared heritage is defined in terms of commonality and universality. Internationala is about long-term, sustainable collaboration that is based also on a critique of the event culture and the so-called project time. So we were also talking a lot about time this morning. So this is a new term that I would add, the project time, which impacts our subjectivity by directing us to focus on the finalization of a project and its fast consumption. Internationala is an institutional network that uses institutional verticality in service of common knowledge. It does it at the same time as a part of a horizontal cultural front of cultural agents of different statuses and different fields, which are locally rooted and globally connected and share the urgent need for a radical transformation of society and institutions. It reacts against the way international art institutions replicates the structure of multinational power and proposes a new space for art which endorses a new internationalism based on the value of difference and horizontal exchange. It understands verticality in terms of reconsidering the role of institutions that would be capable of forming stronger connections through horizontal processes of integrating the knowledge from the bottom without capitalizing on the work produced by their less powerful counterparts. As already the name of the song says, it is about the new kind of internationalism related to networks of collaboration and forms of collective action which challenge the organization of labor and property structures as well as national frontiers. It actually is about the new sense of commonality that works simultaneously on local and global levels providing a basis for new instituent practices that challenge both the formal structures of the nation state and the logic of global capital. So I asked the colleagues, the partners in Internationala, Bartolomeo Marie, November Peitner, and Bardebare, to talk about their own experiences and their own interests coming from their context related to the Confederation of Internationala. So you probably know that we, despite that we are of different statuses and size, you don't know my institution, but it's very small. It is only 33 people work there. I'm comparing to Reina Sofia, which is one of the biggest institutions in Europe. You can get the picture of how different we are in terms of status and size, the institutions in Internationala, but we share some common experiences and common visions. For example, in Slovenia and in Spain, we shared the common experience of dictatorships, isolation, but with the institution in North Europe, like in Benelux, we shared the experience of, can I say, provincialization, which maybe this is also your trauma comparing to North America. So there are some common points, and of course with Istanbul, we share also a lot. We are, at least Slovenia and Turkey, the part of the same Balkan context, and I would say also each of our institutions, it's related to broader links and relations with other continents. For example, the Spanish institutions with Latin America, Moderna Galleria in Ljubljana with the institutions from Eastern Europe, and the most Western and Nordic institutions with Western Europe more than at least we in Ljubljana, and of course Istanbul with Middle East and Asia. So I would invite first Bart you to talk about your own local experience connected to Internationala and your.
Well, I don't know what's interesting to offer for you here. Perhaps I can first say that which levels of networking we had till we decided to become a confederation, which makes it for me a different ball game. First of all, our national government tells us you have to work together with all the other contemporary art museums in the country, which is like a bureaucratic ambition. The bureaucracy of the government thinks that they will have to spend less money if they build a centralized system. So it's a kind of managerial question. And it's what is called national. It's actually, for me, local. The second level is an organization which we have been sharing for some time, informal, which is called Comité of Roosendaal, which is bringing together some institutions from the countries which are called the Netherlands, Belgium, and the Rhineland and the Ruhrgebiet in Germany, which is 3 different countries, including Luxembourg, 4 different countries. But actually, it is what the architect Rem Koolhaas has called Eurocore. It's actually one big urban conglomeration. So it is what for me would be regional. One of our problems is that our region is larger than our countries. And with them we have been working especially around the kind of problem of a changing state of a government and a politics that become, in my understanding, increasingly weak. And the third level up to recently used to be a level of international networking. And there's different kinds. And in a certain way, by far the most qualified one was l'Internationale in its project phase. But in the end, then, it's like you link up. I don't think, I always detested the word networking, but what it means in real terms, in good terms, is that you link up with people and places with whom you feel a value which you share. Now, the outcome of that, as long as it remains networking, is very selfish, if I'm serious. You share a lot of really nice ideas, some dreams, on which, and you can feel a kind of proximity because of that. But in the outcome, you have to take care that your institution runs better. So in the end, you focus still on the real immediate outcomes. And when we are here today, and when I feel in a fragile situation today, is because we decided with these 6 institutions to try to go one step further and really look to which extent we can operationalize a little bit the desires to work on a more longer term base. And it's a fragile thing because we will have to try to make it real. It's not enough to have only the rhetorics which we share, the ideals which we share, but it will be important that we really refocus each of our institutions to some extent to this kind of longer term goals which we share. It means that in the organizations we will have to change the way of working. It means that we will have to start thinking in a different way. I mean, we really have to start thinking like, if we do something for SALT, of course we do it for free because SALT is us. It's not like we do something for SALT, but in the end we charge, but we do it together because we like them. So it's I think a kind of a possible turning point. And as Zdenka has been saying, it might become, in that sense, and for me it's a new level in that sense of challenge, it might become the possibility for each of us to get out of the hardship of being always managerially involved in the moment and having also a kind of operational longer-term trajectory. That's I think the real possibility in which, and what I really like about it, is that it might lead to a kind of ontologically different kind of image. Because the images, as Zdenka has been speaking about, in this kind of multinational way of working, it's always sort of ending up, everything is allowed in, but the image remains one hegemonic, middle-of-the-road proposal. I think we don't want to end there, but we want to end in a kind of a coherent diversity.
Thank you.
Hello again. So I should give some context about SALT, hasn't really been mentioned yet. So SALT is an institution in Istanbul and Ankara now. So we have 3 venues in Turkey. It's relatively young, as is our relationship to the Internationale project. The first venue only opened 2 years ago. But SALT is unique in Turkey in the sense that every institution, every contemporary institution working with culture is not supported by the state at all. Everything is privately supported. SALT in particular is supported by a bank called Garanti Bank, and pretty much all of the programming staff and building maintenance is supported by the bank. So that's pretty unusual in this network. SALT has grown from the research and experience of 3 former institutions that were looking collectively at the visual arts, architecture and urban planning, design, and they also include the Ottoman Bank archives. And this is something we were very excited to take on. The Ottoman Bank archive remains in the main venue in Istanbul, and it is one archive of many that we're now gathering. So the other interesting thing about SALT and its collaboration is that we don't have a collection. I think we're the only institution without a collection that is built up of objects that are art objects. What we do collect are archives. And the first element of that is a large library. Libraries are very scarce in Turkey. There are no real public libraries at all. There are only libraries affiliated to universities, which most people don't necessarily feel they can enter. So there's a library at the heart of the institution called SOT Research. And within the library that's on visual arts, architecture, urbanism, design, there's also the Ottoman Bank archives that have been digitized. And slowly we're gathering other archives that we feel are important to hold on to and to keep and value in Turkey, because other people haven't been doing this job, because, as I said, the state is not involved. And these comprise different kinds of archives, artists' archives, not their works, but the documents, the material that comes from their studios. In particular, Hussein Alptekin, who passed away a few years ago, we hold his archive, Cengiz Çekil, Ismail Saray. And part of the work we're doing is actually to build these archives from scratch. So we're doing the research, we're doing the digitization. We're then working with the archives to potentially do exhibitions. And gradually that's going to be expanded. And in the context of the Internationale, we've already been looking back at different periods. I mentioned earlier about the shift to the Republic, the 1920s, 30s. And as this project develops, we've been looking at the 70s and then eventually to the 80s. So it's a long-term accumulation of material that's completely open to the public. Everyone has access to it. So I think within this collective of museums, one of the key things we're excited about is the fact that we have this access now to really strong collections. Because while we don't have a collection ourselves, there are very few institutions in Turkey that have any kind of collection. So for a long time, the only way you could see international work was through the biennial, which happens every 2 years. And then recently there have been small collections being put together by museums such as Istanbul Modern, but again, that's not a state institution. So essentially it's a private investment in certain kinds of work that certain individuals are interested in collecting.
Hello again. Why was MAGVA interested in the consortium or Confederation of Museums Internationale? In principle, there were several. I detached 3-4 main reasons. One of them is that being located in a double peripheral condition, we are in the periphery of Europe, but we are also in the periphery of a large this part of Europe that is called the Iberian Peninsula, and we were seeing that in the process of writing history, as I mentioned before, I think a museum is not only a museum because it has a collection, but because it uses a collection for doing a number of things, among which is writing or rewriting history. We were facing the problem of being confronted with chronology and a vocabulary which was not applicable or to our context. We had the vocabulary didn't define properly the objects we had in front of us, and the chronology was making reference to events that did not affect our history. But being part of this double periphery, we were also interested in sharing, or we realized that we were sharing this condition with other contexts in Europe that had anomalous or at least intermittent accesses to modernity in terms of industrialization, in terms of laicism, in terms also of having been under repressive regimes, either dictatorial nature with lacks of freedom, censorship, etc., etc. And so we found out that we were not the only periphery, but there were other peripheries that shared these same problems. The idea of learning from those contexts was important not only in relationship of the European context, but also in relation to the South American context, and lately also in relationship to the context of North Africa and the Middle East. The second element was that of the idea of a common European artistic heritage. Meaning, and this idea we developed in Barcelona with the fact that MACBA, as a museum, does not own anything, does not own its collections, library, archives, and so on. This is owned by the city council, the Catalan government, or the MACBA Foundation, as I mentioned earlier this morning. But I don't care that we don't own anything. The question is that we have access to this heritage, and by extension, I turned what could be seen as a weakness into a quality, and we made agreements with a number of other institutions in the city of Barcelona of local, regional, and national character, by which our collections augmented exponentially, and especially towards the field of architecture and towards the field of design. So the question was, why don't we do this at European level? Why don't we start communicating, or at least, why don't we start believing in the idea that the collections of public interest in the European context could be put at the service of scientific projects or educational projects initiated by any of the members of this community, any museum or any institution. And this is what gave birth to the first edition of the collaboration of the project, by which, for instance, in Barcelona we had a fantastic presentation of the collections of the Moderna Galleria from Ljubljana that Zdenka curated, and that showed that under similar political, social, and economical conditions, the actions of artists were very, very, very similar. For instance, it showed that the role of experimental poetry was absolutely central to those contexts, and that the lack of freedom in order to circulate information and opinions gave birth to a lot of strategies which were very similar under these conditions. So that's more or less 2 or 3 of the main reasons that made it, for us, very interesting in the beginning to join.
Okay, so I'll ask some additional questions before going to discussion with the public. So we were from Spain and from Turkey and from Slovenia. We were very much into the question of the history making and the lack of historicization in our context due to the specific circumstances in the last decades, before the 90s, of course. So, Mart, for you, this question of historizations is not maybe so relevant, but still, I think it would be interesting to hear your trauma regarding North America.
We always we have some outstanding disputes which we enjoy. I would say I would not feel any of my colleagues to have been peripheral. I would rather say they have belonged to different empires than the German Empire, the French Empire, or the English Empire. I mean, we are sharing 2 empires which have battled around the border of Slovenia, which is the Habsburg Empire and the Ottoman Empire, which have been remarkable empires, because I think there was a lot more space for diversity within any of these 2 than within the 3 first mentioned. So I think that's something which we might share. And one of the things which we learned from Zdenka is the importance of a precise local historization. And in that term, and that's why in the end, I mean, actually, the dumb people, you know, they come from Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia, they had one of my heroes. It's an experimental artist from Yugoslavia called Mangelos. He was in 1971, he was a curator for audiovisual media in the Museum of Zagreb. At that moment, us didn't have a museum in our country. and certainly not a museum with a curator for audiovisual media. So there's a bit of like nuances that might be made. But the main point, I think, is that when we have been peripheric, I think all of us, in the same way as China has been peripheric, or like most of you have been peripheric, in the sense that we discovered during the research of this kind of post-war avant-garde question, which we posed from the mid-50s to the mid-80s. How do we rethink this? It became increasingly more clear how there was a complete hegemony, not even from the United States, but from New York. You could only get in the seventh heaven if you were a New York artist, a male, white New York artist, not even a US artist. You could get into the fifth heaven, I would say, if you were a German artist, because they were allied. So we figured out that actually, while Eastern Europe, well, the new Eastern Europe from after the fall of the war, has been doing an amazing job in taking their artists serious. And actually our region, like Benelux, we flabbergasted. We were not serious. You know, we hung in with the old version of history, of American hegemony, and in this way got into a kind of a big disadvantage, because our artists, up till today, I don't think they have been researched or taken as seriously as some artists in some parts of Eastern Europe. So we learned a lot from the lecture.
I think it's a very important question for all of us, the question of periphery, if it's still a relevant notion. And I think there are different peripheries and different influences of those peripheries on the, let's say, canons and general ideas. So I would say that the periphery of Eastern Europe hasn't been the same influential as the periphery of the North Europe, and I would say the same for Turkey and for so you will see we don't agree on everything. We are not so homogeneous confederation, and it's good. I think it's our advantage. Yeah, and you know, also it's that we are not so much the same. It's also, I can illustrate it with a program for next 5 years that we concentrated the individual institutions around our most, let's say, at least from the local perspective, demanding themes, like, for example, the Spanish institutions, SALT and Moderna Galleria, we are very much into the research on the 80s. So maybe we talk a little bit about the 80s, why the 80s are so important as a decade for Slovenia, of course, the decade before the collapse.
Towards the end of the 1980s. But none of the material on this period has really been kept. It hasn't been researched in depth. The artists of the time, many of them left the country, so they were creating work perhaps in Paris or in London. And some of those artists have only recently agreed to actually return to Turkey. Ismail Sarai is one, for example, who we've been working with for the last year. He hadn't been back since we invited him. And he was dubious about doing so. And the fantastic thing is that we've now acquired his whole archive, and we're talking in depth with him about working on that in the context of the bigger picture of what was happening in the 80s. And I think for us it's really important, like the periphery of Turkey kind of falls into so many different zones of the world. You know, it's Asia, it's Europe, it's the Middle East, almost the Balkans. You know, in terms of funding, that's always been an interesting issue, because sometimes it means we can't get any money, and other times it means we get very specific money targeted at us. And I think for us now it's really interesting to look at the archives we're working with and how we can locate those in a broader trajectory, perhaps initially through this European network, and later, you know, shifting into other networks, so we can install them in different contexts, and I think that would be really interesting in the future.
Yes, for the context of Spain, the 80s are a very is a historically crucial moment. Franco, the dictator, died in 1975, but the first democratic elections to city councils, I think it's 1979. Before that, there is a new constitution approved and elections to the parliament, etc., and so on. But let's say that our democratic life begins in around 1979, 1980, And art, to be more specific on this, becomes the image of the new institutions, the new public institutions, government, regional governments, because Spain has a federal state structure, although it doesn't function as such, but it does have. And city councils need to show that they are different from the past regime. And contemporary culture, especially contemporary art, becomes official. That is very important also because economically the country begins to boom, and becomes the center of attention for a very short moment. Obviously, I think all these transformations really contain the DNA of the situation we have now. Yet the 80s are too far away to be remembered, and still too close to us to be historicized. So that is what makes it very interesting. It is very problematic, but very interesting for an institution like ours also to share this project with other colleagues in the continent.
Say just a few words on the uses of art, because you are more with the Van Abbe Museum, the idea of the period 1848 to 1889.
Mm-hmm. It's perhaps it's also a kind of an aspiration to try to think a future by re-engaging with the past. And in a certain way, what we did in the project last years before this one was a kind of a secure zone in that sense. It's clear, mid-50s, mid-80s, post-war avant-garde, we can sort of deal with it. And now we are rather going with the things we cannot deal with. Because there was one of the most beautiful moments for me in the former moment of l'Internationale was Emanuel Wallerstein, this grand old thinker, who came to Vienna to a conference of us to lay out his vision of the world. And it is clear that in the 80s something changes in a very deep and fundamental way. And we don't yet really know what that is about. So I hope that by each of these perspectives which we develop, we'll figure that out. And there's another element, especially in Europe, which is that, and that's why we take 1848 as a date of reference. It's not the grand French Revolution of the end of the 18th century. It's not this grand moment, but it's 1848. It's a kind of civil revolutions all over Europe, which sort of extend this project. And that was some kind of a dream. It was a dream of a society that could be made. It was a dream of culture that could enhance that society. What the Germans call Bildung. You can lift up your society. And that sort of thing, it hangs in Europe, but it's lost. There's no one who says, let's go for it anymore. So the uses of art for me, it's also a question of, can we in some way continue by regrounding this belief there used to be in Europe that art could be something meaningful for society, to put it a bit bluntly. And can we, and that's again we got from, then we got again from our colleagues in Slovenia, which has an amazing example of a civil society and amazing thinking about a civil society, but it's obviously also a Marxist. We don't put it like that for the European unity community at large, but of course you can very rapidly relate it to use value, and can we think something else except the kind of economic automatisms.
Thank you. So before opening the discussion, I would like, instead of wrapping out, say that this discussion opens also the questions on contemporaneity. What does it mean? I had before the very interesting discussion with one of PhD students here. Sorry if she's in the auditorium, I can't see her. And we were chatting about the contemporaneity in China, she said it started in the 70s, and I was, wow, in the 70s, why in the 70s? Because, you know, I wrote a text on contemporaneity in our part of the world, and I say our contemporaneity started at end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, so 89, it's this year, the end of communism. Then I was recently in New York, and we had a debate on the contemporaneity with one scholar there, and he was very critical. He said, "Oh, your definition is really strange." So I think, you know, the collaborations and the networks are becoming extremely important to understand ourselves, and, you know, to so I think that Internationale is, it mustn't stay as it is, closed in among the 6 institutions, because today it doesn't work anymore. So if we want to see the bigger picture, we need to make a network of the networks, or, I mean, the multitude of the networks. And maybe at this point I open the discussion. So.
I wanted to go back to something that Bartolomeo said earlier and try and connect it in. I've got two questions here. Bartolomeo, you said internationalization is the only way small cultures will exist within globalization. And I'm wondering what that means in relation to Internationale, and if it has any kind of connection to the reason behind it. I also want to ask about the multiculturalism versus internationalism, and the kind of how that word, has that word ever come into play within your network?
Well, the first question comes from my experience of working in Holland. I was the director of the Center for Contemporary Art Witte de Wit in Rotterdam between 1996 and 2002. And when I arrived there, I realized the center was getting part of its budget from the Dutch government, because they said this institution is one of our main instruments for the internationalization of the Dutch contemporary culture, because the Dutch consider themselves a minority culture, squeezed between the German and the British, right? Of course, I am coming from another minoritary culture, much more minoritary than the Dutch, and I am working in a cultural context which is in constant fight with the dominant Spanish one to preserve language, history, and institutions, among other things. The question is, with this network or with this confederation, we choose to an alliance with other minorities. There is also a major dominant institution among us, the Reina Sofia Museum, but it doesn't really matter in relationship to the spirit or to the founding intention of it. That was the main consideration, and the Slovenian is also a minority culture. The cultures like the Finnish or the Lithuanian or even the Danish are very, very few. I mean, in terms of population, if you compare it to the community of English speakers, or the Chinese, for instance, or even the Spanish-speaking community, which is over 500 million people. So that's the main origin of that quote, which I often use. And in relationship to the multiculturalism, this is a bit more complicated, because I think multiculturalism was like postmodernism, a concept temporarily in use. And I think the international spirit is more related to solidarity. I think for me, multiculturalism is a bit condescending, and the spirit of internationalization is more connected with solidarity than with I allow you to be next to me.
And I would add, it's also multiculturalism is about the diversities that are sooner or later capitalized by the global capital. And the internationalism with its own obvious tradition is about the relation between the singularities and universalities, and I would define the universalities in this case in terms of emancipatory ideas and different traditions, and this is what unites us, I would say. Very different partners, so we try at least to follow the ideas that are the ideas of emancipation in terms of political, social, or cultural ideas, and openness to the constant openness to the other.
And there is something very important as well, is that the tendency or the wish of emancipation, which is clear in our different contexts, is completely compatible with the action of confederation. So it's about being able to choose with whom are you going to dance, not being obliged to dance with what you are supposed to have been dancing for many years until now.
Just quickly, picking on the last thing, so how much is the Internationale dependent on the individuals that drive it? And how much is it, when you talk about a confederation, it sounds like a very institutional kind of project, but in this sense, when you say who you choose to dance with, we connect through emancipatory interest of the different partners, but what happens when the individuals change?
But to some extent, the individuals, I think, are only in a certain way mirroring the wider group of people in an institution. Also because as directors, obviously, you try to go for colleagues that, again, but you're also chosen because you fit and you exist as an institution because you're in a localized situation. So it's more than that, and we will try to operationalize that. And I mean, this evening, the four of us will be together to prepare the meeting in the middle of June in Madrid, where we will be with, I think, more than 30 people from different institutions, discussing on how will we really go about. So we really ambition now that in each of the institutions, the wider institution is going to be structurally involved, and in that sense, but I think it's in a certain way, like we have been saying in different ways now, it's somehow not by accident that it's these places. We have been speaking about the places, not about the people. Obviously the people, because we know one another and we have been working together, we trust one another to such an extent that we say, I am willing to make my position, the position of my institution, vulnerable to Zdenka, because she's okay. And it's not an easy thing to say. But it goes beyond that, I think, and it's really all of our, what is perhaps one of the nice things about L'Internationale is also that we somehow have to deal with this kind of very problematic thing of national, the national. So about localization, and not only so we are in a position that's not a kind of an, obviously we want to be there for all of the people in the whole world. And one of our main drives is that to have a Europe that's in the world, to be in the world. All of us have networks that, and engagements that really do this.
But I think L'Internationale is about people the same way the European Union is about people or individual members. I mean, the European Union is composed of a number of members until the members decide that suddenly one or the other, it's not anymore. And I think there is nothing wrong with that. It's about being able to discuss with whom you want to be.
Yeah, we started with, we of course we knew each other before Internationale, and so we, all of the members, we were into the projects that dealt with minor histories, minor positions, doesn't matter geographically how different and in terms of traditions we were. So there were already common something among us. And not only the projects and problems, but also the visions. And I think this is how we came together, and this is also important when we think about the multitude from the practice. Not everybody, not all the institutions fit together, but there should be something, let's say, universal. It's always something as a glue. So I would never work with a reactionary institution. Why? To be multitude with in postmodern terms, no.
Zdenka, I'd like to ask you about something that is part of L'Internationale's kind of mission statement in a way, is that one of the core reasons that this was instigated in the first place was to reevaluate avant-garde histories, and because there are different versions of art histories that might be under the same banner, and that's particularly interesting for cultures that are engaged with contemporary practice but don't have the same art history whatsoever, and would also have the same issues of having completely different forms of art, forms of thinking under the same name. So I'd like to...
Yeah, one of the projects for the next 5 years, it's called the Vocabulary of Common Knowledge, which one of the interests is also to deal with different terminologies and different traditions. For example, we started with the project about the conceptual art. So we wanted actually from the very, very beginning, even before it became a formal structure, we wanted to make an exhibition on conceptual art in Eastern Europe comparing with Latin America. So that was already something happened before. In one of recent Flux magazines, there was also the conversation with the representatives, the scholars from Eastern Europe and Latin America scholars. So that's how everything actually began, although we never realized that big exhibition on conceptual art. But the issue became so complex and complicated exactly from the reasons that you mentioned, because, for example, for Latin America, there was a question of terminology. Immediately, what is conceptual art? They didn't use this term. And for us in former Yugoslavia, there were many different terms that were very local, but somehow related to the international, let's say, style. But, of course, it's difficult to use this word, international style, because from the first glance, the artistic gestures were very similar in the West, but the meaning and the reception of the same gestures were totally different. And, that's why this is one of the reasons, of course, why these local histories and traditions became so substantial to understand contemporaneity. Not only, it's never about the history, it's always about now, whatever we do related to the past. So, there are many, many different layers and needs that we need somehow to connect. Yeah, I hope I was clear enough.
Hello. I apologize if you mentioned this in the morning sessions, but could you say a few words about decision-making processes within Internationale and representation?
Yeah, they're best up.
He's dictator.
Is there what formal structures you use?
I think they are autonomous institutions. If you are, it's also interesting to tell a little bit about our different statuses. Our institution is the main national institution in the country, and Reina the same, but you are...
In theory we are, but not in practice.
The city...
We are also the main national museum of contemporary art, meaning the Catalan...
In the region, yeah.
No,
yeah.
we call it the nation.
See how complicated it is. So, but anyhow, except SALT, we are public institutions, and we have to follow our own legislation. It's not so easy. It's, there are many different positions. So, first of all, we have to be eligible.
Yeah, the principle of a confederation in jurisdictional terms is that you continue to do everything apart except for those things you decide to do together. Yeah? And up till now, we were a network, which sort of means that you continue if everyone goes along. So what we will have to do in the middle of June is to look how can we keep this good spirit, because it's really joyful if you don't have to speak about decision-making systems. We were never about that, we were always about what can we do together that is meaningful. But now we will have in some way to find some kind of, I think, effective structures without turning into this horrendous managerial world in which is so overarching now. So we want to stay out of that, but still be effective. That's the challenge for the middle of June.
But we should add that, I mean, the Internationale existed before and you've already been collaborating, but even the newer institutions like SALT, we've been collaborating previously. We did a major series of exhibitions with Banaba Museum, etc. So I think there's also, it's a friendship, there are communications we've been having for many years between the partners.
Yeah, I think we are, I mean, of course we are autonomous, and you know, the program, so we conceived the 5 years program out of the projects that were already on the table in individual institutions. So it's, you know, and then we only try to find the common ideas, and yeah.
I think what's really important is the notion of conviviality. No, I mean, I don't think you will so readily speak about decision-making systems in the family. And we have sort of forgotten that in the sphere of culture, you know, it's possible to continue to be there for the sake, you know, of the things you share.
And the bureaucratical way of acting by the European community obliges us to do the same incredibly complicated paperwork. So that unifies a lot.
I wanted to fade away here. Was the person who produced the first exhibition at the Ulan Center, and he made an exhibition called 85 New Wave. It was about the 1980s, the beginning of contemporary art in China. It was historicizing something that had not been historicized. I.e. there's many parallels to what it is that you're talking about being interested in. And I think it's, I don't know if it's possible, Fade Away, for you to speak a little bit about this. I don't know if you can translate the other way. But what's interesting is the response to the audience, because many, many younger people, younger artists were like, why this? Why do we talk about the 1980s now? It's so ancient history, it's not relevant to the way that we think. And so the historicization means something quite different, I think, in this. But you know more, so I wondered if you could say something.
刚才我就是再重复一下Kate Fowle 的那个问题，对，给那个费达伟老师，就是费达伟老师是这个当时尤斯当代艺术中心第一个展览85新潮的那个策展人，所以刚才这个85新潮这个所讨论的问题，就是在回过头来看一个不太远的一个艺术史，可是已经成为艺术史的一个时代。对于这个我们这当前的可能年轻人，有些人觉得是非常重要，有些人觉得莫名其妙。可是这个正好就是这种历史性，就是我们针对我们自己的一些这个历史性，以前可能没有这个总结过，或者是开始真正的研究过，是l'International 就是国际这个联盟美术同盟这个。他们这个美术联盟所讨论的一个艺术史的问题，就是自己的艺术史和其他的艺术史怎么构成一种关系，不管是区别还是有共同点，就是只有这个自己对自己的艺术史有一定的认识，然后才能对别人的艺术史有一定的这个比较，然后通过这种比较和认识，才有一个这个沟通。 所以就是想让这个费老师就是说一说这个当时这个八五新潮这个是为什么要做，因为这个很多可能当时那个有些人已经不是那个时代的人，不知道为什么。
为什么要做？这个我可以讲的比较简单一点，因为这个，为什么要做？我可以讲的简单一点，就是首先这个我们做这个决定的时候是2005年，2006年的时候做这个决定，然后07年07年的年底，对不起，喂，好，我们当时做这个决定的时候是2006年做的这个决定，那么2007年的11月份开展，那么这个时候实际上中国正在进入一个这个当代艺术的价格狂涨的时候，是价格非常高，这是在世界上都是一个奇迹啊，所以当时我做这个决定，也是我觉得是非常有针对性的。一方面，这个年轻的人，年轻一代的艺术家，已经非常不了解的这个80年代，另外一方面呢，这个西方的被介绍到西方去的中国当代艺术，也基本上都是从90年代开始的，然后重新把80年代，对不起。
And so when we made this decision to do the 85 New Wave show, that was in 2006, and that was a time when Chinese contemporary art market just started to skyrocket, and it became almost like an international miracle to see these prices suddenly go sky high. And as the market became more and more in the spotlight, young people at the time were concentrating, maybe looking at the market more than, let's say, at what came before. So at that time, the young people weren't aware so much of the art of Chinese owned contemporary art history, regardless of how short it was, of the 1980s. So that seemed like an opportune and important thing to do while it still hadn't been done.
然后当时我觉得在当时这种高度商业化的环境下，提出一个80年代的一个非常纯粹的精神性的这样一个艺术运动，来回顾这样一个艺术运动是非常重要的。这个其中，对不起，我再加一句话，就是我在展览里边突出了这个顾德兴的那句话，就是顾德兴当时在80年代说的一句话，因为他到了法国去，回来看了法国很多特别好的艺术家的作品以后，回来以后说，中国艺术家除了没有大工作室，除了没有钱，什么都是最好的。那么这个情况，20年以后就实际上是变成一个巨大的讽刺，所以这个展览的针对性是在这个上面啊。
So in the environment of intense commercialization of the art world at the time, in 2006, 2007, that was it seemed particularly important, really important to look back at the 1980s in China when artists were working in a very pure spirit, non-commercial spirit, idealistic spirit, in order to create some kind of context or some kind of contrast to the situation of 2006, 2007. Within this, I would like to quote something that the artist Gu Dexin said in the 1980s. He went to France and saw lots of artists there, brilliant, famous artists, successful artists, good artists, and good work, and came back to China in the 1980s when China was still very, very poor, and said, Chinese artists, except for having good work, big studios, they have absolutely everything. So it was a contrast to saying that they have no money, they have no big studios, but it seems like apart from everything that they need to make work, they have everything. And this in 5 years ago in the very commercial environment, late 2000s, this sentence came back to haunt us in a very different way.
所以当我们在说历史性的时候，我们实际上是有针对性的，不是一般的去谈抽象的去谈历史，而是在对当下的一种形式的一个回应。
So, in order, this kind of exhibition is not just an abstract exercise in art history. It's a very, very important comment about contemporaneity itself.
Any other questions? We are becoming very good at this.
So, yeah, well, thank you very much. 感谢这个L'International 今天来给我们介绍。下一个。